I love that quote by a New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright. Now, he's a British guy, and so whenever he says anything, it sounds smart and intelligent, right? Because he's got that lovely accent. But even when you read it, it's incredibly insightful. He said, in case you were taking a drink of your coffee or finding your seat, he said this. He said, early Christians were perceived as crazy, but everybody wanted them to live in their neighborhood. People thought of them as crazy, but they wanted to be in their community. And they were crazy because they, at least to the people on the outside of the church, it seemed like Christians believed some really hard things to follow. But they wanted them in their community because they were kind, compassionate. Genuine Christians, and that's a key word, genuine Christians, have always moved toward those who are hurting, toward those who are helpless, toward those in need. Alleviated poverty, helped people in real financial struggles. That's always been true of how real Christians have acted. Who started the first schools? Christians. First hospital? Christians. First orphanages? Christians. And we even saw that play out in our community, that in our own church, when we did the Missouri Jubilee, where on August 25th, and in case you weren't here, maybe you're here because of homecoming, and by the way, if that's the case, glad you're here this morning. You picked a doozy of a Sunday to come, but I'm really glad you're here. So to give you a little context, in case you're new, on August 25th, we said, as a church, we wanted to do something in our community to help people we didn't know, but just help people who are struggling. And so the initiative we took was to help pay off the medical debt for everyone in our area that made their income level was under twice the poverty rate. And we had a partner in RIP medical debt, and therefore, for every dollar we raised, he could pay off $100 of medical debt. Too much to explain right now, but trust me. And so we said, look, if we raise $200,000, which seemed like a huge stretch, but we could pay off all the medical debt, again, for those people with financial struggles, in Boone County and the surrounding counties. But the crossing tends not to do things pretty normal, right? I mean, you guys went crazy, and just in a few days, you gave over $430,000. And I got an update from RIP this week, and they said that all the letters went out telling people that their debt had been paid off. And here's what the totals came out to be. The $430,000 here paid off because of the way the markets worked, paid off even more than we expected. Just a smidge under $50 million in medical debt across Missouri, and over 31 counties erased that debt. Over 42,000 households affected by it. And so it's just been amazing to sit back and watch the generosity of the church, but then watch how people responded. For example, there people are sending me screenshots of Facebook posts and other social media posts of people and their response to what you guys did. They would all kind of go like this. Hey, this person is really against Christianity, really against the church, really suspicious of the church. But look at what he or she is saying. And it was always something like, man, I don't know if I like church, but these Christians who did this, it's amazing how many people that they helped. There was a story of a guy who, so let me set this up. We don't know any of the people that received that letter that said their medical debt was paid off. For privacy reasons, we knew from the beginning we weren't going to know. And that's totally fine because we weren't doing it for a thank you. We were doing it just to be gracious to them as God had been to us. But there was a guy comes into the doctor's office here in our local area, and he's got this letter, and he can't quite believe it's true. And so he comes in, and he shows it to this is somebody he owed money to. Is this right? And the person he asked that question to was a woman that happens to attend the crossing. And she said, absolutely, it's my church. We paid it all off. And he said, the guy had tears in his eyes. I mean, can you imagine how many people that through your generosity, God used to affect them and give them hope and let them know that they're not alone? And then you saw the media reaction, right? It was in all the local papers and press, and even a little bit more than just our local area. And they always ask, no, okay, what's next? And I was like, come on, bro, give us a break. We just got done with this. But But I kind of, when I asked that question, I thought, well, I know it seems weird to them, like this is a big deal, but to be honest, you guys have been doing this stuff all the time. It's normal. You use your time, talent, and treasure to serve and help people in our area in so many ways. This one was just a little bit more visible. So that's an example of how people want Christians in their community, because you Christians, you do crazy things that are generous and kind to people you don't even know. But then there's the crazy part, remember? The crazy part. Because Christians have always had beliefs that have led them to live in a certain way that has been offensive to people in culture. So two beliefs that historically have always offended the culture, wherever, whenever, is the belief that Jesus is the only way to God, and sex. The exclusivity of Jesus, that it's only through him that a person can have salvation, their sins forgiven, and that the Christians won't join the sexual revolution. And that's always offended people. Back in Rome in the first century, when much of the New Testament was written, in Rome, the way the people lived, the vast majority of people were sexually promiscuous, but financially stingy. They would give their body to everyone, but their money to no one. And then Christians came along and turned that upside down and said that we'll give our body to no one, but our money to everyone. That sex is within the context of marriage, so sexual restraint, but to be financially generous to people in need. See, that's the way Christians have always, and those two things, sex and the exclusivity of Jesus, have always offended the culture. Well, that brings us to our sermon series. We've been going through the first book of the Bible. It's the book of Genesis. And every sermon comes in a context of a larger series, and so this one is no exception. I would encourage you, if you haven't heard all the sermons, to find them on the app and listen to them at your convenience. Or even if you have, it's important enough, not that the sermons are great, but just the stuff we're talking about is important enough to maybe even re-listen to them. But because we're in the midst of a series, I'm just going to read one verse, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, we're going to deal with a sensitive topic, a really important but a really sensitive topic today, and that is, what does it mean to be male and female? And what does it mean that God created us male and female? And can we switch that? Like, if we're born male, can we become a female? Or the other way, born female, can we become a male? And for some people, this is an idea to be debated. It's like an intellectual exercise, a thought experiment. But for other people, even people here, I'm sure this morning, this is personal. It's not something to be debated. It's your life. It's your experience. It's what you deal with every single day. If that's your story, I just want you to know that while you may not agree with anything or everything I'm going to say, you're not going to get beat up here this morning. You're not going to get picked on or belittled or made fun of. We don't do that here. We're really glad that you're here with us this morning to talk through this, to think through this. Now, I told a few people that I was going to talk about this issue today because it's in the text, male and female, right? So we kind of can't avoid it, but they looked at me like, are you sure you want to talk about that in church? And what went through my head was, well, we're talking about it everywhere else, aren't we? I mean, at least I should speak for myself. I remember when this became on my radar in a major way was back when Bruce Jenner transitioned to Caitlyn Jenner. And there was that interview on 2020, and then the Vanity Fair cover story in which there was a picture of Caitlyn, call me Caitlyn. And then Caitlyn Jenner won an ESPY award. Do you remember ESPN gives those ESPY awards, and won an ESPY award for courage? And around the same time, there was a Time magazine cover with Laverne Cox, one of the stars of Orange is the New Black, a trans woman. And the Time magazine said, the transgender tipping point. This is a conversation that everybody's having, right? I mean, teachers are having it. I know because they're asking. They're saying, hey, I don't know what pronouns to use when referring to some of my students. People in sports are having this conversation, right? Because they're asking the question, can a biological male participate in female sports? The legal community is having this conversation. Just this past week, I think it was, that the arguments were made before the Supreme Court on related issues. Media's having this conversation. In television shows and movies, the trans characters or trans issues are pretty much everywhere. So wouldn't it be weird to say, hey, we're going to talk about this everywhere, but not in church. Let's don't talk about it there. Well, that seems kind of weird, doesn't it? Maybe since we're talking about it everywhere, we need to think through it as Christians. We need to talk about it in church. So we're going to need to talk, kind of get on the same page about what we're dealing with, because some of us are very familiar with these issues, and some of us are pretty unfamiliar with them. So let's start by just saying this, by saying that we've got to talk about this in a way different than our culture. Everybody's talking about it, but we're going to talk about it differently. We're not talking about partisan politics. We're not going to talk about who to vote for or party platform. None of that. That's not our agenda. And we're not going to talk about it in terms of a culture war. Like we're trying to beat those people, whoever those people are. Right? If you're looking for a culture war church, this isn't probably going to be the church for you. We're not in the culture war. We're not even trying to win an argument. I don't want to win anything. I just want to think through how, as a Christian, should we think about this? What's biblical? What does Jesus teach? What's the Bible have to say? How do human beings flourish? What's right? What's best? What's according to God's plan? So let's get on the same page about the topic. We're going to use the genderbread person. Yeah, so here we go. So the genderbread person, this is what is used to discuss these topics, so we're actually going to go there. Gender identity is in your brain. Sexual orientation or attraction is in your heart. Sex is between your legs. And expression is how a person presents themselves. Yeah? Gender identity, an important term. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their own gender, whether male or female or something else, an internal sense of who they identify being. Gender dysphoria is a word we're going to hear a few times today, so if you're not familiar with it, let's make sure we're on the same page here. Gender dysphoria is a condition where a person experiences discomfort or distress because they feel like there's a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. They feel like there's a mismatch between how they think of themselves, what they experience internally, and their biological sex. What causes gender dysphoria? Nobody knows. How many people have gender dysphoria? Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because it's internal, it's subjective, it's controversial. So nobody has a hard number of how many people experience gender dysphoria. Everybody agrees it's a fraction of the population, but a fraction of a country this size still means a lot of people. So I've read estimates of 750,000 to 1 million people have diagnosed gender dysphoria. Why is gender dysphoria more common among younger people than older people? Again, nobody knows the answer to that with any kind of certainty. You can speculate and say, well, maybe it's because it's more comfortable to talk about, more socially acceptable to put on the table now than it ever has been. Or maybe it's through social influence. Like people identify with that because they are being influenced by their culture, by their peers. There was a study out of Brown University, part of the Ivy League. Brown University had a professor there that did a study that came to the conclusion that social influence was a significant part, not the only part, but a significant part of why younger people are reporting gender dysphoria at higher percentages than older people. But there were some activists who loudly, vociferously protested against that Brown study. So the university pulled it off its website and apologized for their professor's peer-reviewed research. 80%, here's a fact, 80% of gender dysphoria resolves itself in a child by the time that child passes through puberty. Jesse Singal, science writer, New York Magazine. While the actual percentages vary from study to study, overall it appears that about 80% of kids with gender dysphoria end up feeling okay with their bodies they were born into. That's important to know. So that takes us back to Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So let's just make some observations. First, we are creatures, not the Creator. And we are creatures that have been created by our Creator and designated as male or female. We've been created male and female. God created us. He created us, created our minds and our bodies, and he called that very good. And what that means is that God designed our bodies and mind to work together, to work well together, to be well-ordered, well-functioning. So Genesis 1:27 teaches that God created two genders that are equal in dignity and worth and value. Two genders that are not interchangeable, two genders that are not arbitrary, and two genders that together resemble God. Think of all the ways that God could have defined human beings in Genesis 1. He could have defined us by our Enneagram number. He could have defined us by our Myers-Briggs test results. He could have defined us by race. He could have defined us by left brain, right brain. He didn't. He defined us as male and female. So what that shows is that gender is not superficial to who we are. That gender is not malleable. And what people often call the gender binary, and when they say gender binary, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that term is used derisively. Like, you believe in the gender binary? But the gender binary is not evidently rooted in the patriarchy. It's not rooted in Victorian-era ethics. Genesis 1:27 says that it is rooted in God. Now, God seems to think that our gender is incredibly important to who we are as people, that it reflects something about him and his glory. Gender is not a social construct. Men and women are foundational to God's plan. God is not pleased when we blur genders. Now, men and women are all created in equal in value, dignity, and worth. Together we resemble God. And yet men and women are different. Now we know that, right? It's hard to define exactly what makes men and women different, but there are differences between masculinity and femininity. Time magazine, 1992. Why are men and women different? And then the subtitle, if you can't read it, it isn't just upbringing. New studies show they were born that way. That's old school. Yeah, I don't know if Time magazine would still stand behind that or not. But there was a book, I never read the book, but remember the book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. I never read it, but it was kind of saying, look, there are differences between men and women and how they relate. I think that was a book that was thinking through marriage issues. Here's the problem, though. The problem is that let me say this. Every culture has ways that it expresses masculinity and femininity, but the Bible doesn't give a solid description on that. So now here's the problem. The problem is that many people have taken a very narrow definition of what makes a person a man or a woman, a very narrow definition of masculinity and femininity, and then tried to force everybody into that. And unfortunately, churches, the church at large, Christians, have reinforced those narrow definitions. So stereotypically, right, if we just went to the extremes, we would say men love sports, violence, hunting. They're just kind of like borderline Neanderthals. And women, if we went to the other extreme and had a stereotype, we'd say they love to wear dresses and have tea parties. Well, what do you do then with a woman who has short hair and loves football? Or what do you do with a man who loves art and is emotional? Well, the thought is that if I don't find myself in the way that society has defined a man or a woman, then maybe I'm not who I think I am. But the problem is that we have had too narrow of a definition, unbiblical definitions of masculinity and femininity, and then tried to fit people into artificial stereotypes that we should have never had in the first place. When I was a kid, if you go back and look pictures of me, of what my favorite toys were growing up, they were dolls. But who cares? My family didn't freak out about it. Now, I know some of you are probably saying, okay, look, Genesis is a good book. I'm glad it's in the Bible, but it's old, isn't it? It's ancient. Are we sure we're even interpreting it correctly? I can hear somebody saying, I'm more of a Jesus Christian than a Genesis Christian. Oh, great, fantastic. Because if you call Jesus Lord, and if you consider yourself a Jesus follower, you're going to have to wrestle with this issue because Jesus talks about it. In the context of a contentious debate with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, Jesus brings up Genesis 1:27, Matthew 19. This is Jesus talking. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So Jesus quotes Genesis 1:27, male and female, and then quotes Genesis 2:24 about marriage. So in other words, Jesus thinks that Genesis is from God. Jesus thinks that it's inspired. Jesus thinks that Genesis is binding on every human being in every culture and every time period. And in fact, when he's having a controversial discussion about a difficult topic, Jesus goes back to the book of Genesis and says, let's see how God designed us from the beginning. Let's see what God's intention is. See, Jesus thinks that living by biblical sexual ethics is what's best for you and me. Jesus thinks that when human beings live by biblical sexual ethics, that's what brings human welfare and human flourishing. Now, maybe some of you are saying, well, that's great. I get that Jesus thought that, but that's a long time ago too. And, we've had some research done since then, and bless Jesus' heart, he did the best he could. But we're more advanced than that now. I mean, we know so much more than Jesus did. Like, we've had research, we understand about intersex and people born with ambiguous genitalia, and we see things he didn't know about. Not so fast. Jesus did know about it. In fact, he even addressed it in this same conversation. I need to define a word for you. It's not one we use very often, the word eunuch. A eunuch was a man who had been sexually castrated, usually by a king, so that he could be of service with the king's harem. I want this guy to work and be an attendant to my harem, but I don't want to mess with him, so he's castrated, and now he can be of service to me. But then the word developed so that it was used as a metaphor. So watch what happens. In the same conversation Jesus is having, where he's just said, God created a male and female, he says this, verse 11. Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So I want to make sure we're on the same page. Gender dysphoria is confusion about my internal state and how I think and my body. Intersex is different than that. It's a person who's been born with some sort of biological abnormality, perhaps ambiguous genitalia. Jesus is talking about a eunuch, someone who has been castrated, but then he says some were born that way. So in other words, he's using it as a metaphor to say some people have biological abnormalities. Some were made that way to serve a king, and some chose to live that way because they thought God had a calling in their life that called them to celibacy. But here's the point. Jesus knows about something vaguely that we would call intersex, and he does not use it to deconstruct gender. Jesus can acknowledge intersex condition while at the same time affirming that God created us male and female. Does someone born intersex today? We should have incredible compassion, rally around support, and help. In context with their doctor and their family and whoever they want to bring into that conversation, they choose to identify, a person born intersex chooses to identify with either male or female. And we get that we live in a sin-cursed world. And so we get more than anyone that our bodies, our life, our world is broken, that this isn't the way it should be. So we have compassion on those born intersex. How should we respond to the small number of very real people who have gender dysphoria, who have this mismatch between their inside and outside? Well, it kind of depends on who it is, right? I mean, if it's your child or your grandchild and they express something like this to you, just give them a big hug. Tell them you love them. Tell them you love them and thanks so much for sharing something that's so personal and that you're with them no matter what, and nothing's ever going to change how you feel about them. And that you'll work this out together. You'll figure it out together. Maybe that should be our reaction to anybody, compassion. Maybe we don't have to have anything to say right away. Maybe we can just listen and learn and empathize. You know, most people with gender dysphoria, they're not trying to make a point. They're just trying to live a life. They're just trying to survive life like you or me would. Can you imagine how difficult it is to go through life with this mismatch and the anxiety and everything else you struggle with? But now, let's say that after compassion, a person still wants to keep talking about this issue of transgender. Well, what do you say? Well, if the person's not a Christian, I'd much rather talk about Jesus than gender. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to talk about gender with them. I think the Bible has something to say to them about this topic. It's just that gender is not my cause. Jesus is. So I'd prefer to talk about Jesus than gender, but I'm willing to talk about anything they want to talk about. But what if a person's a Christian? By that I mean, what if a person considers Jesus Lord? A Christian is one who follows Jesus. What if you're a Christian who follows Jesus and you experience gender dysphoria? Or someone you love experiences gender dysphoria? Or you just want to think about, how do I deal with this in my world and in this cultural moment we find ourselves in? What do you do then? Well, it all comes down to this, doesn't it? Who's your authority? It just comes down to the simple question, who's your authority? It's not more complicated than that. We've already seen what Jesus says. And we could put more verses up, but it'd be beside the point. It all just comes down to, is Jesus my authority or is culture my authority? Remember when a couple weeks ago and I got out that Bible and I stood on it. I felt like a fool doing it, but I stood on it and I said, look, do we stand on the Bible? Do we make the Bible say what we want it to say? Do we impose our beliefs, our culture, our values on the Bible? Or do we surrender, submit to the Bible, put it above us, and say, even when this is confusing, even when I don't like it, I just am going to surrender to this because the Bible, God has authority in my life. It just comes down to authority. Is it culture or is it Jesus? Let me borrow a story Tim Keller says, and I'm going to rework it, rephrase it, and make it work in this situation we're in right now. Imagine we have a Viking, like a warrior from, say, 1,000 years ago. And this Viking finds two strong impulses in his heart. One impulse is for violence, and the other impulse is that he thinks he's been born a man trapped, or a woman trapped in a man's body. He has gender confusion, gender dysphoria. Now he probably would do what? He would think this violence was the right him. It was the real him. Because his culture would affirm that. His culture would say, warriors like you are intended to break things and kill people. So we champion that. We applaud that. Be violent. Be aggressive. That's what his culture 1,000 years ago would have affirmed. And this other part of him this gender dysphoria, this confusion about his gender, this desire to be a woman, he would repress it and go, oh, I can't think about that. That's not me. Now, what if that same person with the same two impulses was walking down the streets of Columbia or the streets of New York City or some other big city? It would be just the opposite, right? To the violence and the aggression, and we'd go, hey, we got therapy for that, dude. We got a counselor who can help you with that. But for this desire to express himself as a woman, culture would applaud. And so you can imagine him repressing the violence in this culture and being comfortable with the gender change. But do you see, there's no appeal to right or wrong. There's no appeal to any higher authority. It's just whatever the cultural moment you're in. That's what happens when you surrender to the culture as Lord, is you're just following whatever the culture says. And are you sure you want to do that? Because the culture gets a lot of things wrong. It wasn't that long ago that our culture said that slavery was fine. And that it even had a Supreme Court decision behind it. 1857, Dred Scott. Supreme Court decision denied citizenship to black people. That's what culture said. You okay with that, culture? No. Culture is going to mislead you. But Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord over culture and Lord over you and over me and over our bodies. 1 Corinthians 6. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. You are not your own. You are not. You're a creature created by God. So let's deal with a couple topics here. Pronouns. What do you do? Do you call somebody by their preferred pronoun, even if that is not in alignment with their biology? Look, there's no chapter and verse on this, but here's what I would say, is I call people whatever name they present themselves to me. If they introduce themselves by a certain name, that's just what I call them. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. Maybe that's wrong, but I just don't want to put up a wall between me and this person because I'm going to make some stand. I'm just going to call them by whatever name. I'll call you by whatever name you want. I just don't think it's that big of a deal. Well, it's just kindness. Love your neighbor. However they introduce themselves, that's what I call them. Fair enough. There's a difference between the way we talk to an individual and the way we participate in a cultural conversation. So what I've tried to emphasize is that when we talk to an individual is compassion and love and mercy and support, speaking the truth in love. But I just want to take a second and just ask some questions for our culture. Questions for the activists. Not the average person just trying to live their life, the activists. And my first question would be this: are we sure this is best? Are we sure? Are we sure that we want to throw away God's design and deconstruct gender? Are we sure it is best for kids or adults, but especially kids, to go through gender reassignment surgery? Have you read the detransitioning stories? Have you heard the pain? Do you know the best study is out of Sweden, and that 10 to 15 years after experiencing gender reassignment surgery, the suicide rate is 20 times greater for those who have it? Are you sure it's best? Have you just read any of the stories? What about this headline out of the New York Times? I won't even read it, but it's written, it's New York Times right there, front page of the website. It's about a biological male transitioning to a woman. It's heartbreaking to read it. You cannot read the story and not just feel compassion toward this person. It's raw. It's reality. And this person knows that they're getting ready to have surgery that won't help them at all. Are we sure? Now, I'm not saying that's true of everybody, but it's true of a lot. Are we sure it's best to have government tell us what kind of pronouns we should use? Are we sure that this is good for women? Are you sure? Martina Navratilova, maybe the world's greatest tennis player, a woman who reigned on the court and who is, at least in the conversation, as the world's greatest tennis player. She came out a few months ago saying, look, we can't do this, people. We cannot put biological males in women's sports. It is not working. There's not going to be women's sports. Now, she was blasted by the activists, and she did one of those sorry, not sorry things, right? Where she pulled it all down. But she asks good questions. Are we sure it's best to give puberty blockers to children? Are we sure when 80% of kids have this reconciled, this gap between this mismatch between their internal identity and their external identity, 80% resolves? Are we sure we should be giving puberty blockers to them? I mean, these are hard questions. I don't know the answers, but are we sure? It's best for families to erase mother and father and replace it with parent one, parent two. Well, what about another set of questions that's different than those? That just goes like this. If people's subjective internal feelings define reality, then why not with other identities? If people's internal subjective feelings define reality, then why not? Are we going to be consistent with that? Rachel Dolezal, I think that's how you say her name, lived in the upper Northwest, Pacific Northwest, head of an NAACP chapter, presented herself as black, but turns out she was exposed as being white. Now, she says some confusing things, I get it, but if you go back and read through it all, she makes some really interesting points in light of this conversation. Here's one. Don't we all have the right to be exactly who we are? I think that sometimes how we feel is more powerful than how we're born. So why was it wrong for her to present herself as black? If that's what she felt, she says that was her identity, that's how she felt, that's who she identified with. Why was it wrong? Are you familiar with body integrity disorder? It's a rare disease, but it's around. That people have a mismatch in their head between how they think about their body and reality. And so they often identify a limb as something that they don't like, they don't want. Not for cosmetic reasons, but there's something much deeper than that. And they want that limb cut off. Now, there's nothing wrong with the limb. The limb is perfectly healthy, but they want a doctor to come and surgically amputate it. What do? Are we going to be consistent? Because right now what we do is help people, help their thinking process conform to their physical reality. What about anorexia? Where somebody has an internal feeling, a subjective feeling, who sees themselves differently than physical reality. What do we do? Do we just go with what they say is true? Well, we don't do that now. What we do is we try to help their thinking process, their emotional process to realign itself with physical reality. Hard questions. I don't think anybody has all the answers. My goal this morning is to speak the truth in love. I hope that's always your goal and my goal as Christians, to speak the truth in love. And let me say that if you're somebody who has gender dysphoria, you're here, maybe you're here and you want to be called by a different pronoun than your biological sex. Maybe you're here and you present yourself in a way that's different than your biology. I just want you to know that we are so glad you're here. You're always welcome here. You're not going to be belittled. You're not going to be mocked. You're not going to be made fun of. You're not going to be picked on or beat up. We're glad you're here. We want you to come and be a part of our community. As the music team comes back, I just want to pull through something. And that is what Christians have to offer others, but ourselves too. Because it turns out we all got the same needs. And so I think one thing Christianity uniquely offers is compassion. We should be the most compassionate person a transgender person ever encounters, because we know what it's like to be broken. We've experienced that brokenness. Brokenness in our body, brokenness in our soul, in our mind, our emotions. We know we live in a sin-cursed world. So we of all people should be compassionate. But we can also offer hope. Because we know that Jesus comes and forgives and changes. We know that Jesus comes and heals. We've tasted it. And we have that same Jesus that we can offer the world. Compassion and hope. Compassion and hope, speaking the truth in love. Let's give Jesus the last word here this morning. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Jesus says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Amen.